Okay. Right. Thank you very much for coming along to my session today. We're at the end of 2 days, I must say, absolutely fantastic event at Comsverse. I'm glad to see that some people are still here. I was really worried at the beginning, being the very last person, will everyone have had enough, getting their flights and their trains and journeys back home. So thank you very much for making the effort to come and join me today. So I think this session follows on really well if you were here earlier on, just the last one, Christian, talking about all that collaboration stuff. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of that and really the governance behind what we need to do. So just a little bit about me. I'm Nikki Chappell. I'm a principal cloud architect at Cloudway. You might have heard the name before, so we've had 4 of us speaking at this event. I'm a Microsoft MVP, and I live and breathe everything Microsoft Teams, governance, compliance, and productivity. It's really trying to bring that tool to life and balance that need between the security and the productivity. If you don't get that balance right, people just go off and use something else. So you can scan my QR code there. That will take you through to the blog. It'll have information about this and some of the other things that I'm talking about as well. So the agenda today, lots of 5s on here. 5 reasons why sprawl occurs, team sprawl. 5 biggest risks of team sprawl. And then I've got something called the 5 A's of Teams governance. And then we just go into a little bit of detail then about some of the technology. So it's not all about the people side. Just some top tips about the Teams creation process, about that identity governance and managing your teams and your members and your guests, and then that life cycle management as well, just to finish off. It's a short session, 25 minutes. Hopefully I'll get it through in time today. So, team sprawl. It's all about that, I suppose, realisation that suddenly you have got thousands of teams. And I mean, for some organisations I work with, I think the most I've had so far is something like 27,000 teams. And there was only 12,000 people in that organisation. So, you know, whoa. And when you search, you start searching, how many teams have that word testing? It was hundreds. And that arises, Teams is nice and shiny, everyone goes off, they've gone to that training, hey, I want to create a team. What should I call it? I know, test. And you'll just end up with hundreds of them. So that's the kind of realisation that it dawns. And I think especially after 2 years of the pandemic, people switched on Teams quickly. We are now in a mess. You know, people have no idea what they're doing because they've just got too many teams. They're drowning. So some of the reasons why this happens, as I say, some of it is that rushed implementation. And we do understand why with that pandemic things had to be rushed. You know, we had to switch on, people needed to be able to work remotely. So they're now coming to look 2 years later to say, hey, we need to do something. The second one is really important. I've touched on this in a lot of other sessions. No user training. Too many companies think this is an IT technology solution, throw it over the fence to the users and say, hey, Teams is there now, go off and use it. You know, my analogy is when your children go up and they get to the age where they want to learn to drive, you don't just hand them the car keys to a Porsche, or I should say Mercedes, really, and say, off you go round that racetrack. You know, they won't last the next day. You have to make sure they have to go through theoretical tests and everything else and driving instructors and exams and everything before they're allowed to let loose. Why should it be any different from any other technology? We seem to be a bit blind about that. And the next reason why it happens is the lack of discovery. So when you have a private team, you can only see the private teams that you're a member of. There might be another private team somewhere else that you should be a member of, but you don't know. So hey, let's go and create one anyway. The fourth, life cycle management. Now this is not Teams' problem. This is everything, I think, to do with sort of data life cycle management. People don't like to delete anything. Let's keep it just in case. I mean, I worked for a company a few years back. I spoke to a guy there, and he'd been there for 40 years. He said he'd got every single piece of paper and every single email he had ever sent or received in all 40 years, just in case. And that's no different from Team. We're just carrying on that kind of legacy culture. We need to kind of get away from that. And then number 5, no monitoring. You know, we need to be kind of proactively working with this, and the best will in the world, you know, technology is not perfect, people are not perfect. We need to think about how we should be working, and again, it goes back to other sessions. It's a journey, it's that maturity model. Start off small, build, look, see how your organisation changes, your team's shape and processes may need to change too. So that's my kind of 5 reasons. It all comes down to no governance. So what happens? What are the biggest risks, really? Why do we really need to worry about this? So the first thing is kind of stale and duplicate content. You've got duplicate teams, you've got duplicate content, people putting data everywhere. It makes things like search and discoverability really difficult. You've got different versions. You've kind of got risks of the wrong versions of data going out if people don't know where to kind of store the information. Data overexposure. That's a big one. You know, people, again, not sure which team to put in. A real example, UK University. Somebody in the HR team was working on the pay increases for the university lecturers for the following year. They wanted to share it with somebody in the finance team. They posted it on what they thought was the internal finance team, but no, they posted it on the finance team for the students that were doing degrees in finance. So suddenly you'd got all of that kind of sensitive personal data about all the lecturers, their pay and their potential pay rises. And that's because, again, people were not trained, there was no naming standards around. It's easy to make a mistake. Third, data loss. Teams is guest access on by default unless you put any governance rules in. That's for kind of the newer tenants. Again, so we really need to make sure that if people are aware of that, you don't have the board members having a team where actually you have created the team, it's going to be new and existing external sharing by default, and then that data could be shared out. So we had a session earlier on, Raphael was doing one on insider risk. That's a perfect way to kind of get the data out of the organisation. You just share it out, there's no controls. 4, it's the productivity loss. If you make it confusing for people, if there's just too much data, it's just too confusing, people will just go somewhere else. And then lastly, you just end up with that chaos. It goes back down to, I think, some of the sessions earlier about productivity and what stops productivity. This sort of thing is kind of a real blocker to productivity. You know, you're trying to scroll through which team was it, which channel was it in, I can't remember which SharePoint site it is. So what can we do about it? We need Teams governance. Yes, my favourite topic. I know for most people it's not, but I think it's so important just to get that baseline. There's lots of really cool functionality in Microsoft Purview for governance and compliance, but it has to start off with the basics, Teams governance. So it's not about the technology, really important. So we're going to remember 5 A's. So if you don't take anything else away from you today, remember these 5 A's. 1, accountability. It has to come from the top. You know, governance and compliance and those rules need to be driven by the top down. They need to set the expectations of the culture of the company, the way the organisation wants to work, and there needs to be kind of almost like reprimands, that carrot and stick approach to make sure people follow the cultural approach. 2, adoption. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just an IT project. We can't just throw it over the fence. It's also not one-time training. It's a number of projects I've been on. Oh, let's just have 1 week's worth of training. Everyone just turns up and that's it. Teams is evergreen. Microsoft 365 is evergreen. That change is coming on constantly, and we need to build, understand our use cases and grow our adoption over time. Look and find out how it can solve our problems. Number 3, analyse. This is all about analysing the ways that we work. So it's looking at where we can add value to the organisation. How can Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365 applications within Teams, how can that really help the business to grow? So we're looking at ways to automate things, how we can make things more efficient, more effective. At the end of the day, anything that's going to make the company more money. 4, after all of that, we need action. So this is where things like business champions are invaluable in an organisation. You can't have one person driving this, particularly in large multinational organisations. You need a team of champions that takes those insights, takes those rules, builds on that journey for maturity and really starts actioning it, testing it out, learn from it, say that's a fantastic use case, how can we use that and promote that around the organisation. And 5, try and automate some of your processes if you can. There's lots of good tools and like Power Automate, Power Apps, etc. You can start using some of these to automate some of your processes as well. Again, that for me is a real driver to get people into teams. If you can take away boring manual processes from a job and kind of build them into teams, that really helps as well. And also automation here I'm going to talk about now is how we can actually support some of our governance processes. So the first step about this journey is we need to make sure we tackle teams creation. You've got to think of it like a funnel. You've got all of these teams coming in here. The first gate is your teams creation gate. Well, the first gate before that is kind of the business decisions we talked about before. Those accountabilities, those rules, that adoption. It's the rule book. So now you've got that rule book, let's look at what we can do with creation. So step 1, number 1 thing that I always consider is what's called container labels. So sensitivity labels for files and emails has been around for quite a long time. You've now got a concept of labeling for the containers, so that's your Teams and the SharePoint site. The key things here is you can allow or block guests and you can allow and block sharing from your SharePoint sites. You can do other things as well, but they're the key 2 things. If you don't have that and you've got guest access on, by default, a guest could be invited to every team, and by default, every team has got new and existing sharing for its SharePoint site. So every single file in your organisation can be shared outside your organisation. So you lock it down with container sensitivity labels, even if you have 2, internal and guests. That way you are controlling your guest and external sharing access on an individual team basis. Yes?
Do you get them with sort of E3 license and then just into
No, this is with E3 business, I think from business premium licensing. So the key thing is set it up and then remember to go back through all your other teams. So if you haven't got many, you can do it in the admin centre. If not, you can just pull out a list of all your teams, Microsoft 365 groups and SharePoint sites. It covers all 3 elements. Pull out a list. You might have to be manually going through them all, and then you can just, with PowerShell, you can just quickly label them. But that would be my number 1 quickest thing to do to control access. 2, think about naming standards. Teams are being used for different things. So you've got teams for operational purposes, like your marketing or HR department. They've got longevity. They're going to be around for a long time with kind of a stable audience. You've got project-based teams that might only be around for 3 months or 6 months. Some organisations want to be able to have some sort of naming standards for internal and external teams. That sounds great. However, the functionality that you get in with your Azure AD Premium 1 license, the naming standards, all it allows you to do is to pick information from the user profile. So the person who creates the team or the group, it could be their department, it could be their manager, it could be their office. So there isn't a way of saying, actually, this is an operational team, or this is a project team, or this has guests, and this has got internal. So there is something there, but it's very limited. 3, Teams templates. They're useful to use to add some sort of control and process around. Now Teams templates can have sensitivity labels with them. Again, that's useful to say for people to pick if they're not sure, I want a project-based team, I want an operational team, I want a team for the legal department, etc. You can build some sort of rules and structure around that. Now, the next set are all highlighted in blue. These are custom things. So these are things that I recommend that are not going to be out of the box. You're going to have to do some work. Now, you can either do them via Power Automate. Now, I've got a blog on that, so the QR code will take you to that. Or you can buy third-party tools to do it. You could do it via Power Apps, etc., or kind of some sort of scripted process. Duplicate name check. You think, hey, Nikki, why bother? Surely Microsoft sorts that out for you. No, it doesn't, not for Teams. It will if you create an email address or a Microsoft 365 group, which is based on an email. It will say, sorry, that email address already exists. It's exactly the same for a SharePoint site. It's looking for the URL, and it'll tell you, sorry, SharePoint site exists. With Teams, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it from the user side or from the Teams admin center. It will quite happily let you create a duplicate team. And the display name will be identical, so you can end up with 5 marketing teams. Now, behind the scenes, obviously you can't have duplicate email addresses and SharePoint site names, so it puts 3 random numbers after the name. But that's where the problem occurred in the university. They had 2 teams called finance, and, information was leaked. So here, what you can do, and the process I've got in my blog is it just takes the name, looks up the proposed SharePoint site name and say, does that SharePoint site name exist? If it does, there's going to be a SharePoint site, a Microsoft 365 group or a team already existing, and it asks you to kind of choose a go. Some sort of purpose. You need to know why these teams are being created to be able to manage that lifecycle governance. So we can't do that from the naming standards. So again, we need to work out why those teams are being created for, who's responsible for them. So it's capturing that metadata and having some sort of easy labeling. So we can do that again through capturing information. It could be as simple as a Microsoft form, and the way that I do it is it can concatenate information from the form with your proposed team name to come out with a new team name, that's got some sort of codes in it, like PROJ, short for project example. Again, third-party solutions will have this all built in. Next one, approvals. For a lot of big organisations, they lock it down. You have to go to IT. I was working with one organisation, and it kind of was quite a difficult situation for me to be there. I had the members of the board there, and when IT said that they were going to lock down Teams creation, the director of sales said, if you do that, I'm not using it, and just kind of walked out the room. So you've actually got to empower users. You want that control. Have some sort of approval process on it. So it might be, if it's an internal team, you don't need any approval. If it's guests, you need some sort of rules and flows. Again, Power Automate, you can create that sort of thing simply yourself. And multiple owners. So with all of these provisioning things, Microsoft only require you to have one owner. So what happens when that person leaves? You end up with an ownerless group or team. Therefore, it's not governed. So again, you can put processes in to always add at least 2 people. And the last thing is I always like to capture that additional metadata. You might want to use it, say, for naming standards. You might want to be using it for lifecycle management. You can use it to create things for adaptive scopes for retention, etc. If you know the purpose, you can control it. So that's just a quick overview of step 1, Teams creation. Let me go on to identity governance. So this is where we're looking at that time the team is active. We want to make sure the members of the team are right. So when you get an IT security audit, they always come around and say, show me evidence that the people in the teams or you've got access to these different services, that you've gone through some sort of checks and balances. So what can we do? Number 1, have a guest's terms of use. This requires an Azure AD Premium 1 license. Normally, internal staff have a whole host of policies, processes, security training. If you're ISO 27001 certified or something, you've got a duty to make sure that happens. Well, that doesn't happen with guests. They just bypass that process and get straight in. So you can enforce some sort of rules. If they don't accept, they don't get in. Number 2, member access reviews. Now this is an expensive one. You do need the Azure AD Premium 2 licenses for this, for the people who undertake the reviews. What this allows you to do is for each of your containers, teams, groups, SharePoint sites and other applications, you can review the membership on a regular basis. You can ask the team owner or whoever owns that content to go and review and say, do those people still need access, yes or no? That's just an automated process. It just runs in the background. The business owners are in control, not IT. The business owners know their data. They know who should have access. IT don't. Now, you can also do a guest access review. Now, this is just recently written a blog on this, but you only actually need to buy one Azure AD Premium 2 to do guest access reviews. And this is because with guests, the first 50,000 monthly active usage is free for Azure AD Premium 1 and Premium 2 licenses. Therefore, if you do a guest access review and the reviewers are the guests, you don't pay for the licensing. So you need one license to enable the functionality in your tenant, but as long as the guests are reviewing their own membership, so you send them an email, say, if you don't respond, I'm going to cut you off sort of thing and delete your account, you can go through that whole process. Not only can you remove them from the teams and the groups, you can also immediately block their access and then delete their Azure AD B2B account. All automated, one license. Ownerless teams. So there's a new functionality that's just come out, hasn't been promoted very much. It's in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Personally, I don't like it. What it does is when a team becomes ownerless, or Microsoft 365 group, it just sends an email to everybody else in the team saying, hey, would you like to become owner? I mean, you wouldn't do that with your kids, would you? Say, hey, would you like the car keys? You know, would you like access to my bank account? So for whatever reason, that's the process that they've done, but I would personally would not use it. So how you can kind of get around this is make sure you've got multiple owners in the start, so if somebody leaves, you're minimising that risk. And reassign ownerless teams to the manager. So again, if you go to my blog, I've written a process, Power Automate process, instant process that your IT support teams can do. All they've got to do is put the leavers email in, it will go through, find all their teams they're in, find all the groups that their owner's in, and automatically reassign to their manager, which hopefully should be in their Azure AD profile. And running out of time, so the last few minutes we'll look at the last stage, and this is probably the stage that people always forget about. Archiving. So out of the box you can archive teams. Not really archiving, all you're doing is making those assets read-only. The teams still exist, the people are still in the teams, so from a user's endpoint it's still part of that noise and that cluttering. So I'm not a personal fan. Expiration policies. So this allows you to review those groups and teams on a regular basis. If they're active, they automatically get renewed. If not, the message goes out to the team owners to say, do you still want it? So this is why it's important that you have multiple owners, because if you've got an ownerless team or group, then you've got no one to approve, and potentially it could get deleted. And that's the bad thing with this expiration policy. It's quite a hard thing. If you don't reply or you say no, it all gets deleted. So unless you've got retention policies or labels behind the scenes, it gets deleted, and you can recover it within 30 days. Retention policies, so you can use this on all of your teams, chats, channel messages, private channel messages, your SharePoint site content, etc. There are lots of caveats. I haven't got time to go through them, but the key thing to be aware of is the team disappears, but when you look from the SharePoint view, the SharePoint site will remain and is searchable, and so it ends up with a bit of a noise there. But that is one way to tackle it. There's other ways that you can start doing it with kind of adaptive scopes. So if you've collected that metadata from the team, you can automate that adaptive scopes and say, teams in this country, in the UK, need to be kept for 3 years. Teams in Australia might need to be kept for 5. So you can do some quite clever things on that. So, yeah, sorry, I've skipped ahead. So the adaptive scope, so you can collect the information, you can automate the metadata in there to provide access. And then lastly on here, it's move the content rather than delete. Because normally in a team, a lot of it is just kind of chitter-chatter and transient information, because that's the nature of teams. You're collaborating, but you are going to get final artifacts from that. So why not move those somewhere else? Move them to a SharePoint site, which is your archive site. There's ways of doing that either internally or by third-party tools. So really the summary that we've gone through is 5 reasons why team sprawls occurred, and then the risks around that, the 5 risks, and it's really important that these are addressed. If you've got 10 times as much data, you've got 10 times as much risk of a kind of a compliance instance and fines. We looked at those 5 A's of Teams governance, and they are really addressing kind of those business, people, process aspects. Technology always comes last. And then the 3 technology areas that we looked at, how we can actually put some pragmatic controls. Teams creation, identity governance, and lifecycle management. So I've implemented Teams governance, have you? So thank you very much for your session. So please scan there. It's got lots of information, and I've written like Power Automate processes to sort this out. Thank you very much. So, don't know if anyone's got any questions.
Any questions? I'll try and throw just a little. You talked about third-party products.
Yes.
For implementing governance. Have you got much experience? Any recommendations?
I'll just say, talking from from a Cloudway viewpoint, we're a partner with Orchestra, so that's one of the products, and it'll do that, the 3 levels of that process. So it's the creation, it's the managing of the content and the people, and that end of life. So you do need to look quite carefully at some of the products. Some of them will just deal with the team's creation. They don't look at that active management, that reporting, that analytics side. A lot of them you can get trials. So I know for Orchestra you can get like a 30-day trial, have a look, see what sort of a mess you're in, and then decide, whether you want to purchase or not.
Do you think Microsoft will keep adding features so the third-party products, go away eventually?
I would hope so, particularly around the naming, the duplicate naming. I think that's really poor. But when I asked that, they just said, well, that's up to the partners and the suppliers to fill those gaps. It's those product gaps. Yeah. So, I think the key thing is you need to address something. Doing nothing is a bad idea.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Any other questions?
I think we've got more swag.
We do.
This is why everyone's here, really. It's not for me, it's for their swag. We've got lots of jigsaw puzzles by the looks of things.